Well, here we are, quintessential gum trees and blowflies, quintessential Australian scene and noises. Gum trees and blowflies. So, what will we discuss this week or look at this week? Well, obviously you all think you've got rights. That this is a country that relies on the rule of law, and we all have rights. That's what differentiates us from, say, the USSR or China, even North Korea or Iran. Somehow we're different because we have rights. Well, unfortunately, although we see our representatives go overseas and talk about human rights issues in other countries, we never quite look at the situation we find ourselves in 2021. Because most Australians believe implicitly they have the right to freedom of speech, the right to freedom of assembly, the right to freedom of association, the rights under law. And somehow they think that these are constitutional protections. Unfortunately, in the Western world, the so-called liberal democracy, Australia has fewer constitutional rights for the individual against the arbitrary exercise of state power than any other Western liberal democracy. And that's why we can see what happens to both citizens, permanent residents, refugees and asylum seekers in this country when they look for constitutional protection. And if there's one thing that the COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted, is the lack of constitutional rights in this country. Rights for the individual against the arbitrary exercise of state power. Our constitution is so bereft of individual rights that the High Court of Australia over 20 years ago had to find an implied right to freedom of speech during an election campaign. Only during the election campaign, because they decided that although there was no right to freedom of speech in the Australian Constitution, you couldn't have free and fair elections without freedom of speech during an election campaign. Now, we do have the right to pursue our religious concerns. We do have freedom of religion. But as far as any other right is concerned, there is nothing in the Australian Constitution which protects not just the individual but minorities and the majority against the arbitrary exercise of state power. As I said before, the pandemic has highlighted how rights can be swept away, borders can be closed. Now, I understand why this occurs in a pandemic, but the same set of principles can be applied during a vigorous protest movement or people questioning the fundamentals this society is based on. Because the law in this country is basically made by Parliament. And the type of laws which are passed don't necessarily reflect the will of the people. In a significant proportion of situations, they reflect the will of that small section of society that owns the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication. And that's why we never see legislation passed through Parliament which attempts to break down that increasing gap between those who have disposable income and can use this country's laws to their advantage and those who have no disposable income at the end of the day. So do you have the right to remove your labour? Now we jump up and down as a society when we hear that people can't strike in China, they can't strike in Russia. But look at the situation in Australia. In Australia, there is no right to strike. Parliament over the last 2 decades has been able to pass a whole heap of legislation which makes striking illegal in this country. Individuals who go out on a wildcat strike can be fined for up to $10,000 a day. Unions can be bankrupted. They can be closed down. Simply, there is no right to strike. You do have a right to withdraw your labour during a very limited enterprise bargaining agreement period, and then with the permission of the Fair Work Commission. So there is no right to strike in this country. There is no right to withdraw your labour. We even have special legislation which means that members of the construction, forestry, maritime, mining and energy unions have less rights than somebody who brings in $1 billion worth of drugs, smuggles in $1 billion worth of drugs. They have the right to silence. But a member of the CFMEU does not have the right to silence and can be jailed for refusing to answer questions about union meetings or workplace meetings. So there is no right to strike. There is no right to freedom of movement. We've seen that during the pandemic when the states are able to close their borders to other Australians. And that happens because we are a federation of states. And when the Constitution was put into place on the 1st of January 1901, what we saw was the rights of the states trumped the rights of the individual. And the Constitution was specifically written in such a way, although there are freedoms for the individual in the American Constitution, the French Constitution, and even the English, which don't have a constitution, have more individual rights than Australia. It was structured in such a way as to be an agreement between the states and a central government, an agreement about who has what power and when they can exercise that power. If you think you have the right to freedom of association, you don't have the right to freedom of association. The Home Affairs Minister can ban any organisation at any time he or she feels like because they believe it may pose a threat to Commonwealth interest. Not because it's a violent threat, because it may pose a threat. You can be removed from the streets, held and be interrogated for up to 10 days, and once released, if you're not charged, you can be jailed for up to 7 years if you tell anybody that you've been taken off the streets and interrogated by this country's secret services. And if you believe these things don't happen, they can happen. If they haven't happened today, there is the legal right that they can happen. The High Court of Australia found that people seeking asylum in this country can be jailed indefinitely, constitutionally. We see people processed offshore for years, and even although they may achieve refugee status, they are not allowed to settle in this country. We have currently seen the ridiculous situation of Australian citizens being denied the right of re-entry into this country. And the list goes on and on. So if there are no constitutional protections for the individual from the arbitrary exercise of state power, what that means is that any law can be passed in this country if it's supported by both houses of Parliament. The Constitution theoretically is the DNA of a country. It is the DNA of a country. It is what allows, it's what gives individuals and minorities and even the majority protections. And if there are no constitutional protections, Parliament can legally pass any legislation it wants. It can intern minorities when it feels like it needs to intern those minorities because they may pose a threat. It can intern without trial. It can stop people from assembling and charge them with illegal assembly. I mean, this is occurring now during the pandemic, and I understand why that is necessary, but let's not forget, during the Bjelke-Petersen era, it was illegal for more than 3 people to meet on a street corner because there's no protection of freedom of assembly in the Australian Constitution, whether it's pandemic or not. Obviously in a pandemic people make allowances. They allow their liberties to be taken away temporarily to overcome the dangers posed by a pandemic. But people don't give up their rights to the state because the state has passed legislation because there is no constitutional protection. I mean, it's important to remember that when we look at the Eureka Rebellion on the 3rd of December 1854, which had ramifications which went for decades and which continue to have ramifications today in 2021, over 160 years later, what they believed in was encapsulated in the Eureka Oath. We swear by the Southern Cross to stand truly by each other and fight to defend our rights and liberties. They believed that human beings were born with inalienable rights which the state could not take away, which private business could not take away. But today in 2021, these inalienable rights which we are theoretically born with are continually stripped away. Day after day, month after month, week after week, year after year, decade after decade, and they will continue to be taken away via legislation while there is no Bill of Rights enshrined in the Australian Constitution. Now people say, well, a Bill of Rights means that it's a lawyer's picnic. But a Bill of Rights means much, much, much more than a lawyer's picnic. A Bill of Rights enshrined in the Australian Constitution means the High Court is able to determine the limits of state power. The High Court can determine whether it is a lawyer's picnic or whether what's in the Constitution is there to protect individuals, minorities and the majority. Now, we consistently see in this country legislation being passed which removes rights and liberties we never had. We never had legally. When I see people say, we just want to exercise our rights, you don't have any rights, and you will not continue to have any rights until a Bill of Rights, freedom of assembly, freedom of association, freedom of religion, which we have, freedom of protest, and the list goes on and on. Freedom to a basic income, freedom to have the essentials of life because you are a member of the society. There are many freedoms that can be enshrined in a constitution. But when we are dealing with a piece of paper which was written in 1901, which was basically designed to define the relationship between 6 independent colonies and a central government, where the individual was specifically denied any rights in those constitutional arrangements, we have the situation we have in Australia in 2021, where we can see enormous powers which is able to be wielded by the state at both the state level and the federal level. So next time you see Mr. Morrison carry on about the Chinese and their lack of freedoms, and next time you see Mr. Morrison carry on about the lack of freedoms in Iran and Russia and Belarusia and North Korea, the fact is we are no better than these societies. The laws are in place which can deny you, if it's inconvenient to the state at that particular point in time, it can deny you the right to associate peacefully, to protest peacefully, to assemble peacefully, and the list goes on, to speak. The main reason I'm allowed to continue these YouTube presentations and many other activities that I'm involved in is very simple. It's because we have no influence, no power, and no ability currently to organise our fellow citizens to resist the state. If we became a significant movement which posed a threat to the status quo, which posed a threat to the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication, which posed a threat to the current relationships which are entwined in law in this country, they have every law in place to ensure that we can be neutralised. It's happened before. It happened during World War I, when the industrial workers of the world were banned, their assets were seized, their members were jailed because they resisted conscription. And it's happening now, and it will continue to happen until we take the issue of a Bill of Rights seriously. And that is one reason that public interest before corporate interests is a necessary part of the social, political spectrum in Australia today. Because we see a Bill of Rights incorporated in the Australian Constitution as one mechanism where we will be able to have freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, freedom of association, freedom of living a reasonable life in this very rich country where the resources continually are exploited by a very, very significant minority who have extraordinary powers in this country. And with the current constitutional arrangements, change becomes difficult, but not impossible. Think about it. If you're interested in a Bill of Rights, if you want to see a Bill of Rights inserted in the Australian Constitution, if you're sick and tired of having your so-called rights removed by the state legally, consistently, on a day-to-day basis, I encourage you to join public interests before corporate interests. Thank you.